Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the newest update on PTR, patch 11.05, saw even more mage changes. Obviously Blizzard, we can all tell which is your favorite class of this expansion, but come on, say some of these updates for the rest of us. Either way, it looks like mages are actually seeing maybe a bit of a glimmer of hope, at least for a specific playstyle called the Living Bomb Fire Mage. A very popular fan favorite playstyle from the early days of Alpha and Beta that never really got to live in its full glory over in the live realms, and honestly, everybody who didn't get to play Beta really missed out on the glory days of Fire, even though it was all very shortly lived. But could they potentially be bringing that build back in a small way, as we're seeing even more tuning for Fire in particular, as they're trying to bolster up that Living Bomb playstyle? And could it potentially return in its full glory as the Frostfire build, since Frostfire and even Spellslinger are getting even more additional changes as of this week? So for today's video, I wanted to really do a bit of a deeper dive at the mage changes from the recent 11.05 update. As always, if you want to see regular class updates like these for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So first things first, let's start off by going over some of the more generalized changes, starting with the hero talents. First things first, we got the Frostfire, which is available for both, well, Frost and Fire, and this one is seeing some changes, mostly a bunch of buffs all across the board. From things such as the Frostfire Burst, which is procced from excess fire once you reach maximum stacks of Fire Mastery, causing the next Ice Lance or Fire Blast to proc a Frostfire Burst. This used to be a Living Bomb that actually functioned with all of the different talents working with Living Bomb over in the live realms, but they're changing it to a Frostfire Burst, which deals immediate damage that is reduced beyond a target, so it has a bit of a soft cap to it. It also grants you combat rotational procs, which is good to see. With it being Frostfire damage, it also does benefit from Frostfire Mastery, and the buff is damaged by 25%, which seems like a pretty hefty number, but the ability damage itself is not nearly as high as I'd like it to be. Another one is again buffed up is Frostfire Infusion, which does the same thing. Frostfire damage helps the Frostfire Mastery stacks. This one got buffed up by 50%. Another talent that got buffed up is Isothermic Core for both Frost as well as Fire Mages. For Frost Mages, you get to summon a free Meteor, and that damage of that Meteor is buffed up by 15%. For Fire Mages, this becomes Combat Storm, which is buffed up by 25%, which allows this bursty ability of Isothermic Core to be even burstier, which is a big core ability of how Frost Mages right now are able to just drop massive meteors, plus add their shatter bonus towards that meteor, which could result in some amazing damage within PvP content in particular. This Mecha Frostfire was actually something that got a lot of play during the early impressions of the War Within expansion, like Alpha and Beta, especially as a Fire Frost Mage. It was so good. And the thing is, Frostfire could potentially make a return in 11.05 as well, because numerically it was behind for Fire compared to alternatives, but numerically they're trying to make those numbers a bit better. And for Frost in PvE content, technically it is really good on paper, but there's some bugs and interactions with the main ability of Frostfire Bolt that doesn't necessarily synergize with some of the better PvE talents. At the same time though, Frostfire is a very popular and a very powerful choice in PvP, so it has moments where it can shine. It just needs that little bit extra of an oomph in order to be playable and potentially even good again. Then we got a couple more updates for Sunfury, primarily regarding their Gravity Lapse ability, which has been changed by quite a bit recently. Gravity Lapse is now a proper crowd control skill, at least for PvE content. Before, Gravity Lapse was just an ability that rooted an enemy, so when you knock them up in the air, while rooted, they can still auto-attack, they can still use ranged abilities, and even cast spells at the target, but they wanted it to be a proper CC, so for mages, when they use Gravity Lapse against PvE enemies, when they snap the fingers, lift them up in the air, the enemies are now stunned while suspended in the air, which is a much better crowd control ability that's a lot better for proper disruptions. That being said, it is now going to have a slight long cooldown from a 30 seconds to a 40-second CD, which wasn't unexpected. And for all of you mages that were excited about using this ability in PvP, I got some bad news for you. Against players, Gravity Lapse does not stun players, only roots them in place. So the potential availability to group enemies together, snap your fingers, lift them in the air, stun the entire team, and then burst them within 3 seconds, which is something mages could actually do so regularly, is kind of gone. So there goes everyone's dream of potentially getting a pseudo deep freeze back on your bars again. Definitely something that's unfortunate to see from the perspective of mages, but everybody else that isn't mage is probably much happier knowing they're not going to be stunned by this class class in the future. Another buff that mages have gotten is the meteorites from glorious incandescence now spawn instantly. They no longer have this weird delay that it takes a while for them to start crashing down on a target, so then as soon as you barrage an enemy or proc it through fire mage gameplay instead, you'll get those meteorites spawning instantly, which is a nice quality of life improvement. Nothing was worse than hitting an enemy with barrage, and then the tank has to move the mob because there's a mechanic coming out or something, and then those meteors come in super delayed, they hit nothing. So if anything, that is a nice quality of life improvement. As for the actual spec-specific changes, we have few. We have Arcane and Fire to mostly focus on. For Arcane, first of all, have a convenience of actually a pretty massive quality of life improvement. If you're a mage that ends up playing with Ice Flows, you are giving up Shimmer, or like an improved version of Blink, for an ability that allows your next mage's ability to be cast while moving. So it allows you to cast your abilities while on the move, cast some of the other CC on the move, like in PvP content, and this actually would have a weird overlap with the talent of Slipstream, which allowed you to be able to cast Arcane Missiles and Invocation while on the move. However, Slipstream would still consume Ice Flows if that was active, even if you were getting free movement from Arcane Missiles anyway. So basically now, if you have Ice Flows and you're playing around your Slipstream, Ice Flows no longer will be consumed by those free movable missiles, which is amazing for when it comes to mobility for arcane mages, but it's also really good for PvP combat in particular. Although I will say this, the amount of movement this gives you is actually quite next level, because you can basically just execute your entire open rotation while being completely on the move. Another buff arcane mages are seeing is with the Spellslinger playstyle, which they've really been trying to refine over these last few builds. We all seen Sun Fury arcane mages everywhere, and that's basically the only build that's available for arcane mages. They don't have a lot of options. They have a very powerful set of talents and a very powerful build, but they're kind of just locked to one build. So it's weird to be at the top like that, but also not really have a lot of flexibility or creativity when it comes to your playstyle options. But they're trying to make Spellslinger a lot more appealing. And they've been doing this through a number of buffs, specifically to all the talents that support Arcane Orb. Like, they basically were able to take certain talents that buff Arcane Orb, take multiple of these talents and combine them into a single node, but then also give Spellslinger a few more buffs in order to make that orb-based gameplay that Spellslinger provides even more appealing than before, while also giving Spellslinger a couple of ways to change the way you play the class, like playing around shifting power in order to proc some of those splinters, or being able to proc it based off of Magi's Spark, which can better synergize into the Arcane Mage gameplay for more immediate burst. And there's been a variety of different little variations of talent adjustments that we've seen throughout the entirety of this build. This week in particular, they're further improving it with Spellfrost Teaching's talent, which allows you to proc arcane orbs against targets, and now, apparently, properly buffs the damage of arcane orb even further. And I'm kind of hoping that we will see a return of Spellslinger Arcane in the future, because it was one of the easier builds to get into for Arcane. It allowed you to basically play bowling in dungeons where you're dropping in orbs, generating a ton of resources, barraging to generate even more orbs, and that was a very fun gameplay loop for a time being. Though based on some of the early theory crafting and numbers, there actually could be going in a completely opposite direction. Apparently, if you take out the talent of Aether Vision and almost ignore Barrage, using some of the newer talents to cheapen the cast of Arcane Blast, you can actually become a turret class where you just mostly cast Arcane Blast for majority of your rotation. So instead of evolving the class forward with new gameplay mechanics, you're almost like going back in time and almost resetting Arcane Mages back to what they played like during Battle for Azeroth, for instance. So it is evolving just backwards into a cursed timeline. Now, another spec that's gotten a significant number of changes this week is the spec of Fire. And it looks like this build is focused on trying their very best to improve the Lit Fuse mechanic and the Living Bomb playstyle, which was incredibly good during the early days of Alpha and Beta, and just never really made its way into live realms in the same form. Like, you can play Living Bomb build, but it's definitely a shadow of its former self from the early days and early periods. But as of this build, all fire damage is being reduced by 3%. Not the worst gain, but it is a significant gain either way, especially with the fact that fire mages have actually been making a bit of a headway over in the live realms after a few continuous buffs back to back. So it's interesting to see that they're nerfing them for the PTR build. Lit Fuse is a mechanic they're trying to make it a little bit better. They are giving it a slightly higher chance to proc, from a 4% chance to proc to a 6%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a decent bit of gain either way though. And the whole living bomb mechanic has a bunch of different talents that could further amplify its damage. Like there's way too many talents that you can commit into in order to try to make that playstyle even better than before. Things like explosive ingenuity have also been buffed up, where explosive ingenuity increases the lit fuse chance to proc by an extra 4%. So you're looking at about a 10% proc rate. They're also increasing the damage of living bomb. It used to be increased by 25%, now it's by 50%, which again, that seems like a significant gain for the ability under most cases. With the talent of Explosivo, casting combustion grants lit fuse and increases the living bomb's damage by 30%. This one actually is a bit of a tone down from a 40% damage to 30%, but you should be seeing more procs of living bombs either way though, so I guess it should technically make up the difference. To further allow living bombs to allow you to further dive into other builds, to not make a whole build just around living bomb, but try to incorporate it into other damage sources. With the sparking cinders, they're given this talent a chance to proc more regularly, 3 procs per minute instead of 2, while living bomb explosions have a small chance to increase the damage of an next pyroblast or flame strike. And that spark considers damage bonus of 15% for both actually has been buffed for at least pyroblast from 10% to 15, but they toned down the pyro damage because you're already going to be doing a ton of AoE damage with those living bombs anyway, or at least you should be. For Sun Fury Fire Mages, they're further amplifying your overall damage with the burden of power, increasing your Pyroblast damage by 20%, which was initially 15%, but they are reducing your Flame Strike damage from 60% gain to 30% gain. And I think it's mostly to try to make some of the alternative options outside of just Flame Striking a little bit better, because Flame Strikes are basically kind of sort of competing with Lit Fuse mechanic and some of the other AoE components that mages can tap into. Overall though, this is a decent attempt at trying to make the Living Bomb playstyle a little bit better and try to find ways to help it synergize with a more single target oriented build. That being said, however, early numbers still have it down real low right now. To give it credit where credit is due, Living Bomb technically does have now a window where in large AoE situations with specific numbers of enemies, it could potentially shine. The damage buffs, the proc rates, all of these other talents that interact with it could possibly make it just a little bit better, but it still is a shell of what it was during the alpha and beta. And the saddest part about the whole thing with Living Bomb and how they can't really get its damage down back to the perfect sweet spot, because it was great and a competitive option because it was a mix of single target that interacted with enough single target abilities, and its damage was big enough to justify its own existence on that singular foe. But it's of course mostly AoE ability that's all about spreading that Living Bomb and then causing more chain explosions amongst targets, which allowed it to be like a perfect middle ground for Mythic Plus content in particular. The sad part is there's 7 talents that all amplify the damage of Living Bomb, and since they can't have the damage tuned to be too high to be competitive, it's basically you now have 7 talents that are just kind of dead in the water. There's a whole portion of the Fire Mage talent tree that just isn't fully functional, and I think that is such a shame, especially compared to how fun, how amazing, how new player friendly the playstyle was during the early days of the alpha and the beta. And I honestly am hoping that we'll see some justice for Living Bomb in the future and bring it back to the spotlight, at least allow Frostfire Mage and Living Bomb to exist in one way or another. Because that combo in particular was incredibly fun during the early days that many of you that never played during the alpha and beta will just not be able to experience it unless they end up tuning it, which hopefully they will in the future. That being said, for Fire Mages right now, when it comes to the new recent PTR tuning, it does seem like there's slight single target reductions, but nothing crazy, like 4% reductions. But we've seen a rise of Fire Mages over on Live Realms, and I don't think any of these potential nerfs or adjustments over in 1105 will be enough to keep them down for too long. But with that being said, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed this mage update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it, and join our Discord community so we can theorycraft together about some of the different ways that they can somehow, some way save Living Bomb playstyle of Fire Mages and bring it back to its full glory. Or if you want to let me know those thoughts in the comments down below, that would be great as well. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.